todos aqui. Tá? Nós vamos fazer hoje, então, a palestra dentro do programa de multilingüismo, que foi uma iniciativa do Ilea. Nós, então, hoje, a nossa palestra em inglês, nós vamos ter outra palestra em junho também. E hoje, então, nós contamos com a presença da Heather e do Erik. Você não está aqui hoje, não está, mas eles vão falar um pouquinho sobre as universidades dos Estados Unidos, especificamente, assim, mais o foco dentro da estrutura e dos academic skills. Né? Então, o que é o inglês dentro de uma universidade americana, tendo em vista toda a questão que a universidade está inserida na questão da internacionalização. Então, passo a palavra então para os palestrantes.
Great. We're just going to start with a quick introduction of ourselves. I'm Erik Larson. I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I went to Whitman College.
Hi guys, my name is Heather, and I'm from Minnesota as well, from a small town called Avon, and I went to the College of St. Benedict near my hometown.
Great, then we've already had the title of our presentation said. We're going to be talking about universities in the United States, structure and academic skills. But before we start the presentation in earnest, we're going to talk a little bit about the contents of the presentation. So we're going to start out by explaining some key terms and phrases that you need to know before we start talking about universities in the United States. Also, after that, we're going to start talking about 3 different types of courses that are offered at American universities. So we're going to be starting out with a little bit of talk of classes in the social sciences and humanities that are lecture-based. Then we're going to be moving on to science and math classes. And then finally, we're going to talk about discussion-based classes, which are also usually in the social sciences and humanities. After that, we're going to talk a little bit about support services that exist for students at American universities, whether it's American students or international students. And then we'll have time for questions and answers at the very end. All right.
Okay, so the first terms that you should know are college and university, and you may have heard both these terms being used when talking about the American educational system, and there is actually a difference between the two. A college is a smaller institution that generally focuses on offering an undergraduate degree that can be completed in 4 years. This is called a bachelor's degree. You have the same thing here. They are closer communities, and many colleges in the United States are liberal arts colleges, which I'll explain in the next section, but they're smaller and they're more focused on community, and they're focused on the offering bachelor degrees. A university, on the other hand, is usually a much bigger institution, and that is because they offer a wider variety of degrees, the undergraduate as well as graduate, which includes master's programs, PhD programs, and graduate schools. So that's where you can get your law degree and your medical school degree if you want. It's also a little bit confusing because within a university there are colleges, and these refer to the different schools that focus on one subject or another. So a university is composed of different colleges, where a college is just one institution where you can get your bachelor's degree. A side note about this, for the rest of the presentation, I'll be using the term university to refer to both colleges and universities. So, all right, other terms to know. As I mentioned, a liberal arts college is a special kind of college that focuses on subjects that are broad and related to social sciences and humanities. So in a liberal arts college, you can study history, biology, get your bachelor's degree in a subject, but the education is focused on kind of a holistic variety of different subjects. It's community-based, as I said before, so many liberal arts colleges are residential, which means that students come to live at the college and they really focus all their time and energy on studying and spending time together and getting to know their teachers in a more intimate environment. Major and minor are also 2 important terms to know. A major is the main subject that you're focused on studying, and a minor is kind of like a major except to a lesser degree. colleges within the university I've already explained. A grade is what we refer to the letter that you get in the class that indicates how well you performed in the class. So A, B, C, D, or F. Undergraduate and bachelor's degree is, as I mentioned before, your four-year degree, and graduate and doctoral degrees take more time beyond the bachelor's degree. So a master's degree usually takes 2 years, and the doctorate degree takes 4 or more years after the bachelor's degree or master's. Coursework class is just what we say to refer to a single class that you can take, and the two terms are interchangeable. And in the United States, we also have this concept of being graded on a curve, which means that the teacher can take all the grades from a test, for example, take the average grade and make that the new average. So if a test is too hard, for example, and the best student in the class got like a C, all the averages can be moved up depending on the bell curve of what the students received, and the teacher will know from then on to make the tests easier or harder. Another big difference in the United States is that you have public and private universities like you do here. The public universities are funded by state governments, and they're usually more inexpensive than a private college, but they still cost money for the students. They're not free like they are here. In a private university, you rely much more on tuition and fees, so they're more expensive, but depending on how many donations the private universities get from donors or companies or the alumni, tuition is usually comparable to public universities, especially if the student can find more scholarships on their own. Now we can talk a little bit about our schools. Oh, I can talk about St. Vincent. Okay, so Jose's not here, but he attended the University of Florida, which is a really, really big university, and he had a much different experience than Eric or I had in our much smaller schools, as you can see by the number of students that we had. I went to the College of St. Benedict. I'll be talking more about my school in another slide. But it was a small liberal arts college, as I mentioned, and we were focused on community, and we only offer a bachelor's degree, so there was no opportunity there to get like a law degree or a medicine degree, for example.
All right, and just to continue with this, I went to Whitman College, which, like Heather's school, is a super small liberal arts school, has 1,500 students, so it's smaller than my high school was. Very, very small. So to start, we're going to be moving on to talking a little bit about University of Florida first, and then we're going to talk about lecture-based social science and humanities classes. So I'm going to be taking the role of Jose here to talk about the University of Florida. The university, again, has 50,000 students, and it's in a small town called Gainesville in Florida. Gainesville has fewer residents than there are students in the university. So in the United States, we call towns like this college towns because the majority of the people who live there are students or faculty or staff at the university. So it's a very interesting dynamic between the school and the community. So Jose, when he has presented this before, he talks about how big the campus is. It takes about half an hour to walk from one side of campus to the other. It is also one of the schools that has like a lot of importance on big sports. So this is the stadium that they have for football. It holds 50,000 people. So everyone who goes to the school could be at a football game at the same time. And their mascot is the Gators. Jose explains that if you meet someone who has also gone to the University of Florida, they probably wouldn't say, I went to the University of Florida. They would say, I'm a Gator. So they're referring to themselves by the mascot of the school. He also likes to talk about how at the football games that they have, people spend hours doing the alligator chomp, which is something like this. All right. So Jose also took political science classes. That was his major at the University of Florida. So he had a lot of classes in the social sciences and humanities that were related or that followed the format of lecture-based classes. So basically how this works is public universities, like this one, have to offer a lot of introductory classes to tons of students. So the way that they end up doing that is they have enormous classes, say, you might have a class of 300 or 400 or 500 students, all in a lecture hall or attending the class online. And then that class breaks into smaller groups with teaching assistants, or TAs. So there's a professor who leads the giant class with 600 or 500 people. And then the groups with the TAs, I think, break down into groups of around 30 or so. So the nice thing about that is you get a little bit more attention when you're with the teaching assistant. You're expected to participate in discussion. You're able to ask questions in a way that you aren't able to when you're in this enormous class. Jose talks about how it's very, very intimidating when you're in front of this many people to raise your hand and ask a question, because, I don't know, what if it's a stupid question? You're going to have 500 people looking at you at the same time with a horrible look on their face. So, the way that it breaks down in terms of time is usually it's a 2-hour lecture, and then there is an hour a week with the teaching assistant. So the way that breaks up is it ends up being 3 credits, which is basically like the number of hours that you have a week, because you have the 2-hour lecture and the 1-hour teaching assistant time. All right, so some expectations for these giant classes. No matter whether it's for like a social science class that's based on a textbook, or a literature class that's based on books and poems that you're reading, you're expected to have the reading done before the class with the professor. We're going to be talking a little bit about syllabuses or syllabi later, and we'll get a little bit into that. But at the very beginning of the class, you have all the readings listed that you have to have completed before the course, or before each class period. Again, with these enormous classes, you are expected to participate when you're having smaller class with a teaching assistant. It's a way to kind of delve into the material in a way that you can't when you're in the giant lecture. When you're in the lecture, the professor will be talking about some interpretations of the text, maybe bringing up some interesting ideas that are related to the text, but you won't have that opportunity to debate and discuss things like you do in a small group. All right, and now we're going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to talk about some of the different types of assessment that we have in these classes. So classes like this require papers, which are graded by the teaching assistants, because professors don't have time to grade 500 papers. So it's a really interesting relationship that you have with your teaching assistant. It's a person that you get to know well, who's doing the grading for you. And something that Jose talked about is the fact that if you want to apply for jobs on your campus, if you want to apply for jobs off campus, if you want scholarships, things like that, you usually need recommendation letters from professors, which is a little bit hard with these classes since they have so many students. So what Jose suggests people do is talk to people who have taken the class before and find out which teaching assistants have a really, really good relationship with the professor, so that that teaching assistant can write a recommendation letter for you and the professor will sign off on it, which makes things a little bit easier. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit more about academic papers that you have to write for these classes. Basically, the goal of papers for these classes is to synthesize and interpret information that you have been learning about in class. So it might be comparing a couple different texts or delving into one text in particular. Oftentimes you're going to have to use resources or materials that were not included in the class materials. So Jose, when he was writing papers, would often go to the library, look through their catalog, but more importantly, use the online catalog, because there's lots of resources that you can access online through the university library's website that wouldn't necessarily be available at the library itself. So he likes to say that you don't even have to go to the library, but you're going to have to use the library's resources. I think here he was just giving us an example of how the paper is laid out. So again, you have like your title page. Your paper will probably be formatted like this. Generally, I think more introductory level classes might have papers that are around 10 pages long, double-spaced. If you're in higher level classes, your papers might be more 15, 20, something like that. Also, in all of our papers, we have to cite as we go, and the way that you cite depends on what discipline you're in. Like history has a different way of citing than English. And then at the very end, you have to do a works cited. So, Jose also talks about how classes are selected at the university. So this is something that we'll get into over and over again. But at American universities and colleges, even if you are studying biology, say, you're expected to take classes in other areas. So you might take classes in English, or in physics, or in French, or something like that. So it doesn't matter what your major is, you're probably going to have requirements in all of these different areas, in the social sciences, in the humanities. You can see here, if you go to a big university, you just have so many departments, and you have so many classes to choose from, which means that if you have a social science requirement, or a humanities or science requirement, you can really choose classes that are interesting to you, and maybe you can choose classes based on other things as well. For example, what you've heard about the professors, what times the class are, when the finals are. Jose says that he never took a class before 10 a.m. in the morning because he always looked at the hours of the classes beforehand, and if it was at 8 or 9 in the morning, he just said, nope, I'm not going to do that. So that's kind of the nice thing about American universities, that you can kind of build your schedule how you want. You can choose the subjects that you want, and you can find the hours that you want as well.
Okay, we're going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about my university, which was nothing like the University of Florida. The College of St. Benedict is a small liberal arts college, like I said, near my hometown. It was also a religiously affiliated university, so it was a Catholic college. And there are many different types of religiously affiliated schools in the United States, so there's a lot of options. If that's important to you, if that's important to you, you can consider that a part of your college search. But there were also many Catholics that went to St. Ben's and had the option of not participating in that part of university life there. So there's just a lot of different choices when it comes to choosing a school in the United States. We were also an all-women's college. My school was really weird. So it was an all-women's college, but we had a brother university down the road called St. John's University. So it wasn't an all-women's college in the true sense that I only saw women, I only had classes with women, but because we had a relationship with the brother school, our classes were mixed gender. We could eat in each other's dining halls. So it's a really interesting environment, and you'll find that a lot of schools in the United States have their little interesting quirks that you can consider when choosing a school. As part of being religiously affiliated, some classes were taught by monks and nuns, which is just kind of a fun little quirk. And it was also a residential campus, which means that students were required at my school to live on campus. So I think here I've noticed a lot of students live with their parents and then they commute in and then go home and have dinner with their parents every night, which is really nice. But for some institutions like St. Ben's, the school really values that the students spend a lot of time together, so they'll study together, they'll eat together, they'll have roommates, and they'll just really fully participate in this kind of college or university life. So I'm going to be talking about the science and math courses. As Eric mentioned, a lot of the students have to take a wide variety of different courses. So I studied English and Spanish. English was my major and Spanish was my minor, but I ended up taking a chemistry class, a genetics class, and a nutrition class, which are all science and not related to my studies, just because they were part of the core curriculum. which made for a really interesting experience because I was able to relate lessons from one class to another class and really have kind of a well-rounded learning experience. So the science and math courses in the United States tend to have labs, which are additional classes where students complete hands-on tasks such as experiments and like dissections. Sometimes labs are also an opportunity for students to come and solve problems together based on the theories they learned in class. But they're essentially just additional classes that you may not get extra credit for. They're just an extra class that you have to go to in addition to a more lecture-based science or math class. Science and math courses tend to be lecture-based and test-based, so it's usually a professor explaining theories to the students rather than the students discussing. And instead of writing papers, the students will spend a lot of time studying for their exams. So examples of science courses are chemistry, biology, physics, nutrition, astronomy, and some examples of math. You have statistics, algebra, calculus, so the same types of science and math courses you can find here. Here is an example of a typical science syllabus. So a lot of the syllabi will have the instructor's name and their contact information so that they can be easily reached for questions. They also have, the location and place of the class. A lot of them list the textbook that's necessary and all the most important information, such as course description and objectives, what the reading for the class will look like, when the exams will be, how many exams there will be. A lot of syllabi also include the makeup policy, which is if you skip class, how many classes can you skip without having your grades suffer. So basically a cheat sheet for the class and what you can expect as the semester goes on. Grading is another big part of this because the grading varies by professor and by class, so you can see what percentage you need to earn to get an A or an A minus or a B, etc. The more thorough syllabi will include a schedule of every day in the class. So if you were sick, or if you and your family are planning to take a vacation, it's easy to know what you should study in the future in terms of like reading the textbook or getting notes from a friend. Here's an example of a lab report you might find in a science class in the United States. This is a generic example taken from a physics lab. And it usually starts off with a conclusion of the experiments, and then this one actually includes the objective, the method, the data, analyzing the data, and a conclusion at the end. So this is a generic example, and they'll all look different, and it'll depend on the class what it looks like, but this gives tips on how to put together one that might be acceptable for like a normal class. And then this one is one that has already been laid out. So this person started with a purpose and explained it. A lot of them include like the materials that they use for their experiments and then asking questions. A lot of formulas. Here's an example of how a science or math test in the United States might be laid out. So this test is about a quarter multiple choice questions and so on. A lot of them have multiple choice, and then there are short extended responses, nothing resembling a paper, but there are some written portions, and then performance questions, which tend to be like hard science where you use formulas and solve problems on paper so your teacher can check it. Here's an example of one of the performance questions I was just mentioning. They'll usually have graphs or some sort of visual that you can analyze, and just questions about what you see and what you solve with the formula. So the English skills needed for this kind of course are usually very based on technical terminology. And that also gives you the power to read more in-depth academic journals or academic articles. Usually the vocabulary is very specific, so if you're taking a course in, like a more advanced course in chemistry, for example, you might learn a lot of English vocabulary that like a normal like English student or someone who's studying history might not know. So that's pretty cool. You'll learn like a specific set of skills and be able to use it. We talked about this already, so yeah, covered that.
All right, so haven't talked that much about my school, but it's similar in a lot of ways to Heather's. Small school in a small town. It's a residential campus, so everyone lives in dormitories or in houses around the campus. It's also a very, very small campus, so it's like about 2 city blocks big. So it's easy to get anywhere around. I'm going to be talking a little bit about discussion-based classes. So we talked about some other lecture-based classes in the social sciences and humanities. I think maybe it'd be a good idea just to see who here studies the social sciences, so like history or anthropology or things like that. Does anybody study social sciences? Okay. How about humanities? Humanities would be like languages and art. All right. And do we have anybody from the hard sciences and math or computer science, physics, chemistry, things like that? Nobody? All right. So it seems like a lot of people in this room are, if you were to go study in the United States, you'd have classes like this. These are discussion-based classes. So discussion-based classes are an interesting type of class because it basically means that the professor is not taking as much of a leadership role as they would in a lecture-based class. What the professor does most of all is facilitate a discussion or debate between the students in the class. If you can move on to the next slide. So these classes are also very small. In my college, I think the average class size was about 20 people, something like that. So these classes are anywhere from like 15 to 25 people and 1 professor. So it's a kind of a small deal. All right, so since these classes are so much based on discussion and debate, it's really important that all of the students who are in the class participate. This can be a little bit hard for people who are a little bit more shy or a little bit more reserved because part of your grade depends on you participating in the class. Sometimes people who have a little bit more trouble with that participation will talk to their professor and find a solution that works for them. So maybe they're going to create a goal of saying 3 things during the class. Or maybe it would help them to have notes written about things that they want to say before they go to that class. So even for those who aren't naturally, who aren't as predisposed to participate in class, there are ways of making it easier for yourself. As I said, grades in these types of classes depend on how much you participate. I think in most classes that are discussion-based, the participation grade might be something like 10% of your total grade. So in that, the professor is going to evaluate how much you participated, but also how well you participated. If you're contributing, or if you're speaking a lot, but you're basically just repeating what everyone else says, you're not contributing well. So the professor is going to take that into consideration as well. Some professors try to make this grade a little bit more objective by like tallying how many times you speak, or maybe taking notes of who says what during the class. But this type of grade is so subjective. So we have, like, on one end we have tests, which are pretty objective, right? Like either you have the right answer or you have the wrong answer. Then we have papers that are a little bit more subjective. So the professor is looking for certain things, but I don't know, it might depend on the day, on their mood, on who you are, what grade you get. Also, then we get to participating in class. That kind of grade is very subjective. What it often comes down to is how good of a student does your professor think you are? Because it's very hard to quantify how many times you participated or how well your contributions have moved along the discussion in class. So, another thing that often happens in these classes, most of the grade depends on papers. So we have papers, we have class discussion, participation. Oftentimes you have to do oral presentations as well. Sometimes that is an oral presentation on a term paper or a final paper that you do for the class. So for example, I took a few law classes at my college, and we spent the entire semester working on one big research project that we then presented orally to the class. Some things to keep in mind for these oral presentations are there's often a very strict time limit. So say you might have 15 minutes to present, and then you'll have 10 minutes of question and answer afterwards. Some professors are very strict about this, so they'll set a timer on the desk, and when the buzzer goes off, you can't speak anymore. So you have to rehearse very well, because of course you want your presentation to be well rehearsed, you want to feel confident and calm while you're doing it, but also because there's a time limit, so you have to know more or less how long it's going to last. This is just an example of one of the oral presentations that I gave for one of those law classes that I was just talking about. So I didn't have a script of everything I was going to say, I just kind of had bullet point notes that guided what I was going to say and how long it was going to take. Part of your grade also might depend on leading discussion. So the professor oftentimes will lead the first few discussions. So say for 2 classes or 3 classes, the professor is going to come with a list of questions that hopefully will spark discussion with the group. But after that, oftentimes they delegate that responsibility to the students themselves. So at the beginning of the semester, maybe they'll have a list of all the class periods, and students will have to sign up for 1 or 2 of those periods where they are going to lead that discussion. What's important for this type of activity is that you read the text very thoroughly. Maybe you'll have to read it 2 times, 3 times, just so that you know it backwards and forwards. And you also have to be able to create open-ended questions that are a little bit controversial. So you can't have questions that have like yes or no answers or that are looking for specific pieces of information from the text, because that's not going to spark an interesting debate or a cool discussion. For these types of questions, you have to leave them a little bit more open-ended and think about whether students are going to have different opinions or interpretations of what you've been reading. All right, so again, here's an example of some discussion questions that I created for an English class that I took. And so we had read The Good Soldier. I read some passages of it several times, and then I created these discussion questions based on that. All right, so that kind of concludes talking about the discussion-based classes at American universities. But we thought we would kind of wrap up with a little discussion of support services that exist for people who need more help. First of all, we have academic advisors. I think you have something similar here in Brazil. So when you are especially doing your master's degree, you're going to have a professor, a member of the faculty, who helps you, who guides you, who gives you advice. For undergraduate students, that also happens in the United States. So when you enter the university, you're going to be assigned to a professor who is maybe teaching something that you're interested in. For example, I entered the university, I didn't know what I was going to major in, like a lot of American students. I just went in like, all right, well, history sounds kind of cool, English sounds kind of cool, I have no idea what I'm doing. But I knew that I was also interested in Spanish, so I got an academic advisor in the Spanish department. And so that person is there to guide what classes you take. They're probably going to advise you on what classes to take when. And they're also there for any other academic questions that you have. So that's the first type of resource at American universities. We also have office hours. So on the syllabus that Heather showed you guys, it had the professor's name and email address, phone number, and then it probably had office hours at the very top as well. So those are several hours each week that the professor is required to be in their office and available to you if you need them. So if you have questions about a test that's coming up, or if you want to bounce ideas off your professor about a paper that you have to write, you can go to office hours, and if they're doing something else, they have to put it down and they have to help you. It's a really cool idea. Oftentimes, American students use office hour, go to office hours without a specific academic question. If you have a professor that you'd like to be your mentor in the future, or that you want to build a relationship with, you can go to office hours just to chat if you want to. So, I don't know, if you have problems in your personal life, sometimes if you have a relationship with a professor, you go and just chat with them during that time. So that's kind of cool. We also have writing centers at American universities. So basically, if you go to an academic resource center or to a student affairs office, they can probably direct you to a writing center or find you tutoring if you need that. What a writing center is it's just a space on the university that has specific hours that it's open, and students can drop by with any questions they have about their academic writing. So if you finished a paper and you still have a couple days before you're going to turn it in, you can take it to the writing center and somebody will review it for you, give you suggestions on how to improve it. The really cool thing about writing centers is that it's students who are working there. So it's students who have gotten good grades on pieces of writing in the past, in writing classes, who are hired by the university to help other students. So it's a kind of a cool thing. It's like you're getting help for papers when you need it, and also those who are already at a higher level with their writing are getting experience in tutoring and mentoring others. The same thing happens with tutoring. So if you're having trouble with a chemistry class, say, the Student Affairs Office or the Academic Resource Center has a list of people who've taken chemistry in the past who've done well and who are going to be tutors for people who are struggling. So you might meet with your tutor once a week and they'll help you with chemistry concepts that you're struggling with in your class. Again, both the people who work at the Writing Center and tutors are hired by the university. So they're paid by the university, which means that the services that they offer to students are free. So for any of these things, it's not something that you have to pay for, which is a really cool model. All right, so that kind of wraps up the support services section. We would like to open it up for questions now. Does anybody have questions about what academic life at American universities is like? Don't be shy. You can ask questions about specific types of assessment that we have, or specific types of classes. Maybe just to start, does anybody here intend to study abroad either during their undergraduate or for some sort of graduate degree? Raise your hand if you're planning on studying abroad at some point in the future. Okay, so a few of you. Do any of you that just raised your hands have any questions about what it might be like? Yeah.
How are the advisors chosen? Like, how do you...
So I can speak about how it was chosen at my school. So the way it works at my school, since you enter and you don't have to declare your major for 2 years, you are assigned someone in a field that you've shown interest in. So you could say at the very beginning, oh, I'd be interested in having an academic advisor in these departments. And that's how I got someone in the Spanish department. When I eventually declared my majors, which were Spanish and political science, I chose who I wanted to be my academic advisor. So I knew which professor I liked the best in the department or that I had built the most relationship with. And I asked that person if they would be my academic advisor. In both cases, they said yes.
It actually worked the exact same way at my college. And I want to emphasize that I don't know how it was at all schools, but at my school, if you chose an academic advisor and then your interests changed, or you even changed your major, you're allowed to change it as many times as you want. So there's a lot of freedom with working and taking time to find someone who best fits your needs.
Are you supposed to have to write any end of course paper or dissertation? Because here, students, undergraduate students are asked to do that.
At my college, it was not required to do any sort of a thesis or big test. We had what was called an honors program, which if you had a certain GPA from high school and you were accepted into this competitive program, you were required to do a thesis, but it was not required for everybody.
And at my school, whether you had to do a thesis or not depended on the major. So for both of my majors, Spanish, poli-sci, I was required to do a thesis. We had to do, I think for Spanish it was a 25-page paper, and for politics it was 40. We had to write the paper, which was a long process, during which we got a lot of advising from professors. And then at the very end we had to do an oral defense of that paper as well. So that was kind of the capstone project that we had to do for our majors at Whitman.
And did you publish those texts?
I didn't publish either of mine. I know that some people in the United States do. I know that Jose, for example, has friends who went on to publish their undergraduate thesis. Oftentimes it helps if you have a professor who really likes your work, who's willing to sign on as if they co-wrote it. And in some ways they did co-write it because they were there editing and giving you suggestions the entire time. But that gives you a much better chance of being published if you have that professor's name on there as well.
Yes.
Did you share rooms with classmates in the university, like we see in the movies, for example?
Like in the dormitories?
Yeah.
Yes. I had a roommate my first year, and then after that I would share apartments. Usually when you're first year, you share a room with one other person, and then as you get older, you get better and better living conditions, so you can share an apartment with some of your closest friends, for example, but this is very common in the United States. Especially at residential schools, you have to live on campus, and usually that means living with another student. But there are single options as well, to have a room of your own if that's important to you.
And you have to pay for the dorms?
Yes. Living expenses are usually attached as part of the overall cost for university, but yes.
Something else. Here we have, professors usually have research projects, and we usually invite students, undergraduate students and graduate students to participate. And how is it organized in these things in the university where you study?
To do research with a professor? At my college, and I think at a lot of colleges, the students will express interest in the research project of a professor, and they can approach a professor and talk to them and ask if there are any opportunities. Another way that is done is professors who are looking for help in a project that they know a student can complete will usually advertise the position and invite students within their department to apply. And then it's a competitive selective process where the professor will meet with everyone interested and then select who they think would be best for the job.
And I do think that with some professors and some projects, the professor kind of handpicks who they want to participate. So yeah, I have some friends who majored in chemistry or psychology, for example, and they were selected by the professors because they did really well in class. So I think the professor sometimes will do interviews and have a selection process, but sometimes they'll just cherry pick who they think are the best students to help them.
And are students paid for that?
Yes, I think in some cases you are. In some cases you aren't, because it's just considered a resume builder. So it's something that you put on your resume that will help you get jobs in the future. I have some people I know who refer to resume dollars. So you aren't paid any real money, but you're paid in resume dollars.
But you can also take it as a course credit, right? And then in universities where I studied in, or students could take research as independent studies, and that was worth a 3 credit course, whatever. So there was some motivation to do it.
Yeah, that's true. And if you are getting credit for something, you won't get paid for it. So. Any other questions?
You say that you didn't publish your papers. That make it harder to get a master's or a doctorate sometimes. Or publishing, you make it easier.
I would say that it's pretty rare that an undergraduate would publish a paper. So I don't think that it makes it more difficult to get into a master's program, because I want to say that a lot of students haven't published in like a really prestigious journal, for example. What do you think?
So master's programs select people based on a lot of things. So it's kind of like, you probably have heard about how admission to American universities and colleges is different than it is here. We don't have one big test that determines whether you get in or not. And the same is kind of true for master's programs. They look for your academic experience, what classes have you taken. If you've published things in your field, if you've done research in your field, we also have a test that is included as part of your application to graduate schools. That's called the GRE. That's a standardized test. But as with like undergraduate admissions, it basically is the school considering you as a whole. So if you've published things in your field before, that will definitely give you an advantage. That'll be a good thing, but it wouldn't necessarily hurt you to not have that. All right, so I think we'll end now. Heather and Jose and I are going to be here until November. And we'd love to answer any questions that you have about academic life in American universities. So you can get in touch with us by email. If you are here because you know one of the ISF professors, they can give you our Facebook names. And we're also going to be around campus as well. So if you see us around and you have a question, feel free to talk to us.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you very much for the lecture. E eu queria então só falar algumas coisas. Em primeiro lugar, eu queria me apresentar, não me apresentei no início, eu sou a Auditório. Eu sou uma das coordenadoras do ISF, coordenadoras pedagógicas. E a professora Ana Fontes também é uma das coordenadoras. A professora Ana Fontes, que é mais responsável por tudo. O que eu queria fazer? Eu queria apresentar os professores. Então, levantem, porque a gente tem pessoas aqui que não são professores do ISF, mas são professores. A grande parte da audiência são professores. Certo? Claro, isso é tal, obrigada. E, na verdade, eu queria dizer também que é interessante ouvir, muito interessante ouvir, né, o que se faz, né, e de uma forma super atualizada, que é o caso que a Heather e o Erik estão passando para nós. E dizer que os nossos professores também têm horas de monitoria. Então, eventualmente, se algum dia vocês tiverem alguma necessidade específica, além de dar aulas dentro do âmbito do ISF, eles também podem dar suporte para um abstract ou para uma revisão de algum texto, né? Enfim, vocês precisam simplesmente marcar um horário com os monitores. Nós temos 5 monitores. Na sala 125 do Instituto de Letras, né, da sala administrativa, do prédio administrativo. E aí, então, estarão à disposição. Certo, gente? Então, agradeço a presença de todos. Né? E só peço que os professores fiquem mais um pouquinho aqui, que eu ainda preciso falar alguma coisa com eles. Ok? Eu agradeço a presença de todos.